Welcome to the Dragon's Den. I'm your venerable host Orochi, and today we are going to talk about the only thing that really matters: dragons. Specifically, today we are going to talk about a book series called The Bound and the Broken, the first book being Of Blood and Fire by Ryan Cahill. This is going to be one of the first books I'm reviewing where I do not say that I believe that this is a good book to read if for specifically being a dragon fan. And we'll get into the things that it does wrong on that front in a bit. But first and foremost, the big thing that this series does well is characters. Character development in this is at a peak above most other things that I've read in quite a while, and that may or may not actually be a good thing for some people, because I think at least the first third of this book is just the daily life of the three primary characters and fleshing out their daily routines, the things that they go through, their families, their relationships with all the people around them, so that when the call to action actually happens, you know exactly what these characters are losing, which I think is a fantastic thing, because a lot of the times you don't get that sort of connection with characters in you don't get a good feel of how that character feels, because you don't really have a connection to the things that they're losing, or the things that they're sacrificing, or the things that they're having to say goodbye to and maybe hopefully get back to, or maybe just losing some other things entirely. Whereas this really gets into setting up the lives of these characters and what they're going through, and if you can get through it, it it's super good, but it does last a while, and it might not be the kind of thing certain people are looking for. But even beyond that, you can easily look at these characters and just sort of brush them down to what their basics are, because there's the primary character, the character whose point of view you see like 80% of the story, and his story you can just brush it down to he's the hero. He's your average good boy. They all come from a small town, a small village out in the sticks, so they're all like farmers and carpenters and like the sons of these hardworking families, and so that's the sort of background and lifestyle they have. So you can brush the three of them down to one of them's the nerd, one of them's like the outdoorsy huntsman type, and the main character is the has slight training with blade, light soldiering training good boy. But and the hunter guy is also sort of like the jokester. And so you can see like these top level things that these characters are, but you start to get to know them just going through their daily life and the daily trials they have. And like the first big problem in the book is that the three of these kids have to go through a coming of age ritual, which is go out into the forest for X amount of days, survive or don't, and try to come back afterwards. Which seems a little bit archaic and that sort of stuff, but whatever. It's a trial of manhood sort of thing, which all of that sort of thing has problems, but during this adventure you really find out a lot about these characters, and Having started off as just the good boy, the jokester, and the nerd, like, you start rounding these characters out as like, oh, the jokester guy. Normally, that sort of character archetype is somebody who just brushes off other people's feelings and, attempts to get close to them because they have, deep seated trauma or whatever. Or another angle of that archetype is usually just somebody who likes to lighten the mood with everything because they're very easygoing and that sort of stuff. But you immediately start to tell that this character's, oh, they're a jokester and they're not really good at anything else. They have problems with their dad because they don't seem to be able to pick up the family trade, and so he's got all of those kinds of problems. But then you start finding out, like, oh, he was incredibly good with a bow. For somebody who has not trained extensively in it, he's just got an amazingly sharp eye, a steady hand, and he's notoriously good with a bow. And he's also just got these ranger qualities. He's good with the bow. He likes animals, even though he doesn't spend a lot of time, he doesn't work on the farm. He doesn't spend a lot of time in the forest like, a Snow White kind of character where he's taking care of animals all the time. But when they're out and they're hunting animals, he goes through all of these things where it's like, oh, well, you have to reduce their suffering and you have to, be the most efficient at doing this sort of thing, where the other characters are like, wow, we've never seen this side of you. And it's like, that's great character building, especially within, these other characters that these three boys have lived their entire lives with each other. They've been friends since they were little kids, and they're still finding out things about each other when put into these, abnormal situations, which is fantastic. And you just keep. The character depth in this is fantastic. And once you get beyond the primary three characters, once their adventure really starts kicking it up, the story continuously introduces new characters, constantly new characters that come in and out of their lives, and it does much less of a job fleshing these characters out because you don't spend nearly as much time with them. Like, you don't spend a third of the book with all of these characters. But the characters that they do start hanging out more with are also, like, very deep characters who have a lot of different things going on. And once you start picking that up, you can just kind of assume that, yes, every character that this author introduced has a lot going on. They have a lot of different personality traits. They're actually, you can easily see these as real people, which in a lot of stories is like, they're characters. You can kind of tell that they're characters, and that's usually a good thing because real people do random stuff because you can't tell what the hell's going on in their head. Whereas that's the benefit of books, is you can generally get a good handle on how these characters think and what they do. But in this, these characters feel more like people because of the depth that the author takes to round out their personalities and give them all of these different traits and all of these different desires and interests. And that is super good if you can get through the slowness of those parts where it's building their characters up. So that is, if you like very well written characters, that would be the thing to go into this story for. Because this descriptions of stuff is mediocre. It's good. It's not as bad as some of the other things that I prefer reading, but it's not, like, over the top. Like, none of the other things the author does is anywhere near as good as his character building. The world building is fairly decent. It's at an even slower pace, I would say, than the character building, because it's all from the perspective of these, you know, kids who are in their middle late teens, and so they have no world knowledge whatsoever, and they also live in a small village that's literally separated from like the major civilizations of the continent they live on by supposed cursed forest. That, you know, when you get to the middle and other side of this forest is where once upon a time all of these beast folk lived, and they were all brought to the world by this dark power or whatever, and so they feed on human flesh and all this stuff. So it's like, yeah, nobody goes all the way through the forest because once you get to the heart of the forest, it's really bad. Nobody comes back. Nobody crosses the forest. Everybody just travels by boat, which is extremely expensive, and or they go, you know, like a 4-month journey around or whatever it is. So it's this big thing of these towns are extremely separated from the larger portion of society, and so these kids have literally no knowledge of anything of their world whatsoever, except for by like a traveling bard who's stopped at their village like twice in their lifetime or something like that. And those are the only stories of things going on outside of, you know, their little conglomerate of towns that are, you know, look after each other and trade with each other and stuff. So you learn at the pace that they do, which is sort of slow because there is no exposition does not happen in this. There's no character who's like, oh, hey, here's the history of the world as I know it. Like, none of the character, there's no point where there's just an exposition dump, which in some ways is a little unfortunate because there's a lot going on. There is a long seated history here, and you have to slowly pick it up bit by bit and tiny little fragment by tiny little fragment as people, these other characters you meet, like slowly absently reveal the things that they know in the conversations they have, and they're like, these kids don't need to know this sort of thing, and I don't have the time to give them a history lesson and that sort of stuff. So even when it does become an issue that, yeah, these characters should know some history, they are given some history lessons, but it's usually brief little things. It's like, oh, we stopped this night, we go over this thing for half an hour or whatever, and then over the course of weeks they slowly pick up this sort of stuff. But it's still like there are 10 other things going on at the same time that are more pressing matters than just history exposition dump. So I think that's really great because that makes you feel more tied to the primary characters, because, you know, these other people who you meet know more about the world in general than you do, and they're like, I would love to tell you, but I just don't have the time. We're real busy on, you know, all these other things that we got going on. And so it really puts you in the feel of these primary characters, where it's just like you're trying to pull your own weight, but you are blind to where you are going, which is, I think, is generally a good thing when you're trying to do like the hero's journey kind of thing. It's like you're learning as you go, which is great. But looking at the overview of the story, you could easily get to a part like halfway or like all the way through this first book and then finally realize, oh yeah, I don't like the story of, you know, where these characters are going or the history that they've uncovered. None of that catches my interest, which could be a problem. But if you like the characters, especially because of the depth of character development that's in it, then I think you would definitely pull through till the end of the series. That's what's kept me going with it, is because the characters are just really fleshed out, and I like that a lot. But The thing that makes this not a recommendation for Dragon fans is that when the primary character learns that he is going to be the next fabled dragon rider, it's a shock to everybody, and it happens rather quickly. And which I think is a really cool thing, that these people who are trying to do this stuff, they're not working off a prophecy or anything. They're just doing their best to fight against an oppressive regime who basically has immortal dragon riders as their like supreme elite troops. And so they're like, we have the last dragon egg in existence. We've struggled for decades to accomplish this thing, and now we have no idea what the hell we're going to do with it, but we've sacrificed so much just to get this, to have a vague chance of not even being able to level the playing field, but just to have a piece on the field that can play in this game, because they have nothing so far. And then when it just suddenly turns out, it's like, oh, this kid from nowhere that you picked up is this. It shocks everybody. And I think that's a really cool thing, because then it's not the sort of, oh, you were the chosen one, you are ordained. It's like, why you? And the main character's like, how the hell should I know? And I think that's a great thing when even it's a very different feel from there's a lot of things where it's like, oh yeah, you're the chosen one, you must obviously be this person we've been looking for, whereas in this it's kind of like, well, we were hoping to have somebody fill this role, but oh wow, you gotta prove that you can do this, because otherwise you just screwed us all by stepping in and taking control of this thing. Even if it was an accident, you're here. You've done this. You better be up to the task, because we're gonna ask a lot of you. And that's such a great different angle of looking at the chosen one kind of thing, where it's like, yes, of course he has to be the quote unquote chosen one in the story, because the dragon egg attuned to him and the dragon hatched for him, whereas tons of other people have touched it and done the exact same things, and none of them have resonated with it and had this happen. So of course he has to be the chosen one, but nobody understands what that means, so they're all just skeptical about it, which for the main character, that sucks, because that's just, hey, here's 30 more leagues of save the friggin' world kid on your shoulder out of nowhere. And that's just a lot of stuff without, any of that smoother transition of, oh yeah, we were expecting you kind of thing that most stories have, which is really great. The problem is that once the dragon is born, throughout its growing phases, it is basically portrayed as an animal. It can't speak. It has like telepathic empathy with the main character, its chosen rider. But even in the telepathy that they share, it doesn't form words or even like pictures or anything. It's just, he just gets raw emotion. And even as the dragon starts growing up over the course of the story, and even into the second book, that stays the same. That it just says, oh, there's, a keen intelligence behind there. And it's like, well, what do you define as intelligence? If it can't even learn a language, is that real intelligence? Like, can you have intelligence if you can't even, like, learn sophisticated ways of communication? If you're just stuck with emotions, then that's kind of a primitive. Even if you have telepathy, that's like got to be the most primitive kind of telepathy you can imagine, right? And I have a problem with that. That it never gets to this point where they can even like communicate on even a medium level, not even like words, but at least concepts. Like their telepathy needs to evolve into a form where they're communicating concepts to each other, either by pictures mixed with emotions or just some innate understanding, just something, because otherwise, to me, it just feels like less of a dragon and more of like a lesser drake of some sort. It's like, sure, it's intelligent in the way that, monitor lizards are intelligent. It's like they can plan out routes and to ambush things, and they memorize the terrain so they can like take shortcuts to cut and their prey off at the pass, whereas the vast majority of animals are not smart enough to do that. They just chase until they run down the thing that they're after. They don't have the object permanence and to be able to turn their attention to something else to take a shortcut. Like that alone is like a level of intelligence above most other creatures on the planet. And but that's still a far cry from the creatures that we actually view as intelligent, creatures that recognize their own existence, dolphins and corvids. Like it's still just a monumental gap between those species. And even there is, you would expect more from a dragon. I personally would. So the fact that it kind of relegates the dragon to being like the animal sidekick is, I really don't like things that do that. And if it wasn't for the incredibly good character building in this, I would have stopped reading, especially after the first book. But after, finding out that as the dragon reached like young adulthood, it's still limited in its communication, I was just like, no, that rubs me the wrong way a lot. So it's a toss up. You're either going to be able to like this a lot because of the character building and the sheer number of characters in it that all have like key parts to the story and also a lot of depth to them. And every time it switches to a character's perspective that isn't the main trio, especially characters that they haven't yet met, is incredibly good, because then it like super speeds the world building, because you start seeing things from completely different perspectives by people who have a lot more knowledge of things that are going on or that have happened, and the certain things that are happening now that will obviously intersect with what the main characters are going through. So that is the way the plot is woven together is really good. You might not like the overall implications of what it is, but the way that it's made and the way that the characters are made, even if you don't particularly like most of the characters, because in the grand scheme of it, I don't particularly have a great fondness for any of the characters in this. Like, the jokester was obnoxious at first, but it's the things, you can find something within these characters that you're like, all right, this is a common ground that I and them could share. And so, I get a little bit of investment in them because of that. Whereas a lot of the time, most characters are a lot flatter and harder to pick up on, and it's more of, hey, here's a diverse cast, so at least you can like somebody in it. Whereas this is like, we've got a diverse cast, and there's a good chance you'll find something you like in most of these characters, which I think is a really big positive in this series. But if you're going into it expecting to find like good dragon content, then I would say tamper your expectations. The dragon bits are pretty cool, but I prefer to have dragons be at least human levels of intelligence, or at least being able to communicate on that level. Because there's another book series I will do a review on at some point where the dragons had human levels of intelligence, but they could not communicate. So they were treated like animals, even though they were very intelligent, which was super compelling to me and just a very interesting story. I'll do a full review on that eventually. And there's another book in that series I'm going to have to read soon and do that too. But if that's the sort of thing you're looking for, you probably won't find it here. And this is just maybe barely a step above a dragon just being an animal companion, which you will either like or dislike. But other than that, there's a lot of good stuff going on in it. And so, as a dragon book, I don't recommend it, but as a character-driven story with a fairly good and interesting plot, I definitely recommend it. So, hopefully other people will enjoy, and if you've read it or after you read it, go ahead and share your thoughts of it in the comments. And that is all for now. Until next time.